By the third morning, no one in the valley was moving. The storm had come down from the northern passes on a Thursday, and it had not finished by Saturday, and it showed no intention of finishing by Sunday. The wind was the kind that does not howl, it presses. It leans against a structure the way a patient thing leans, not in a hurry, not dramatic, simply committed to finding what is weak and recording what it finds. 6 feet of snow had settled across the Bitterroot by the time the worst of it passed. 6 feet where it was even, 11 and 12 in the drifts against the timber walls, and in the low places where the valley floor dipped near the creek, where most of the settlement's cabins had been built because the ground was flat and the water was close, and those were the two things most men thought about when they chose a building site. In those low places, the weight had become a calculation that the rooftops were not built to solve. 3 structures collapsed before dawn on the second night. 2 more followed by morning of the third. A man named Harlan Cutter had been in his when the beam let go. He had survived by the particular fortune of standing in the doorframe at the moment it happened, having gone there for no reason he could later explain, except that he had wanted to look at the storm and had not been able to sleep. His wife had been in the bed. She had survived as well, buried under the fallen roof for 11 hours before the neighbors reached her, and she did not speak about it afterward to anyone who was not family. From the hillside above the valley, from the low stone structure built into the slope beneath a sod roof that had been growing undisturbed for 4 years, that was now invisible beneath its own weight of snow, that was so perfectly matched to the mountain behind it that a man approaching from below would not have known it was there until he was nearly upon it. From that hillside, a man named Elias Croft watched the valley and kept count. He had a lantern burning in the doorframe and a dog beside him, and one hand resting against the sod overhang above the entrance the way a man rests his hand against something he has tested and trusts. He watched the low places. He counted rooftops. He was already thinking about who would need to be reached first, and how deep the snow would be on the lower path, and whether the Halverson family at the far end of the settlement would have managed the night in a structure he had looked at twice with concern. He had not expressed out loud, because he had learned long ago that expressing concern about another man's roof was not something that was received with gratitude in this country. How many down there were still breathing? He did not yet know. But he knew his own walls were standing. He knew the sod above him had taken 6 feet of snow and had not trembled. And he knew, in the way that a man knows a thing he has spent years making certain of, that when the storm let go and the valley began to assess what it had lost, the question people would ask him, the question that would come with some portion of embarrassment from men who had laughed at the sight of a grown man hauling river clay up a hillside for 3 seasons, that question was already forming. How did you know? He had known because he had paid attention to the right things. That is where this story begins. Elias Croft had come to the Bitterroot in the autumn of 1881 as a man who had spent 22 years reading mountains for a living. He had trapped the northern ranges from the time he was 19, not the romantic trapping of the story papers, the actual version, which involved long cold mornings, careful observation, accumulated failure, and the slow construction of a body of knowledge that could not be acquired in any other way. He understood snowpack the way a doctor understands a pulse. He understood drainage and exposure and the behavior of wind around rock formations in a way that had nothing to do with formal education and everything to do with consequence. When you read a mountain wrong in that work, you felt it. He had also in his middle years spent 2 winters working with a survey crew laying rail bed through mountain passes in Montana Territory. He had watched masons work stone in conditions that would have stopped other men, and he had watched those stone structures, the retaining walls, the tunnel facings, the bridge abutments, do what timber framing could not do in the same environment. He had asked questions. He had been the oldest man on the crew by 15 years, and the masons had answered him without condescension, because he already knew enough to ask the right ones. By the time he came to the Bitterroot to trap and eventually to settle, he was 51 years old, and he had been thinking about how to build a winter shelter for a long time. The parcel he bought in the spring of 1882 was called Madman's Ledge by the men who knew it, which was explanation enough for why he had been able to purchase it for $7. It was a south-facing slope above the valley floor, angled steep enough to discourage flat construction, exposed enough on the approach to look like a poor choice, and set back against a stone outcropping that most men looked at as an obstacle. Elias Croft looked at the same outcropping and saw a north wall that would never need to be built. He looked at the slope and saw natural drainage. He looked at the southern exposure and saw passive winter warmth from a sun that would be low in the sky. He looked at the overhang of sandstone above the ledge and saw a structure that had been managing snow load for approximately 10,000 years and showed no signs of fatigue. He paid the $7. The men who watched him carry the deed out of the land office did not say much that afternoon. What they said afterward, in the saloon and at the feed store, and at the places where men collect their opinions about other men, was that old Elias had finally paid too much for too little, and that trapping had perhaps done something to his judgment, and that the ledge would make a fine place to bury him. When the first winter finished the decision, the mountain had been unable to complete on its own. Elias Croft was not a man who required the agreement of others to feel confident in a choice. He began building in the spring of 1882. The first thing he did was nothing. He spent the first season on Madman's Ledge watching. He watched where the water moved when it rained. He watched where the wind came from in the evening and where it shifted in the early morning. He watched where the snow lay longest in the early spring and where it melted first. He watched the way the sandstone overhang above him shed its snow, cleanly, in controlled slides, without the dramatic avalanche behavior that the open faces above produced, and he made notes in a small book he kept in his coat pocket. He trapped through that winter and lived out of a canvas shelter on the ledge, and was cold in the way that a man is cold when he has made a considered choice to be temporarily uncomfortable in exchange for information he cannot get any other way. By spring of 1883, he knew enough to begin. He cut no timber for the primary structure. The valley men watched him haul sandstone from the outcropping with a mule and a sled, and a patience that they interpreted as stubbornness, because in their experience those two things occupied the same space and were easiest to distinguish only in retrospect. He fitted the stones without mortar on the foundation courses, the way he had seen the railroad masons do in the passwork, tight-fitted, carefully chosen, each stone keyed against the ones beside it, so that the wall's strength came from the relationship between pieces rather than from any adhesive between them. The walls went into the hillside on the north and west sides rather than sitting on top of the ground. He dug back into the slope and let the earth become part of the structure. The south wall, facing the valley, was the only fully exposed face. He kept it lower than a standing man's head. The entrance was not centered but offset to the east, sheltered from the prevailing wind by a short stone return wall that turned the approach and prevented the door from becoming a direct channel for cold air. The roof was where the valley men focused their attention, and their attention was not admiring. He built a timber frame, this much he did with wood, because he understood that a roof is not a wall and its engineering is different. But he built it with a pitch that matched the hillside angle rather than the conventional steep pitch that the valley cabins used. Then he laid split wood decking across the frame, sealed it with river clay worked into a thick paste, and over that he laid sod cut from the meadow below in courses, overlapping like shingles, grass side down for the bottom layer and grass side up for the surface. The valley men came up on a Saturday in the spring of 1884 to see the finished structure, and returned to town with the conclusion that the old trapper had built himself an unusually warm-looking hole in a hill, and that the sod roof would dissolve in the first serious rain, and that the chimney, a short, dogleg affair built into the north wall that vented not straight up, but at an angle through the hillside, emerging from the slope 15 feet behind the structure, was either the cleverest thing they had seen or the strangest, and they could not yet tell which. Inside, the structure was something different from what they had expected. The floor was stone, the walls were stone, and the earth behind them was an insulating mass that the indoor temperature never fully separated from. There was a bench along the south wall built of the same material, which held the warmth of the afternoon sun that came through the single south-facing window and released it slowly through the evening. The food stores were kept in a rear alcove dug directly into the hillside, where the temperature remained consistent regardless of the season. Stone, air, water, heat, none of them were treated as enemies. They were managed, directed, given their proper channels and allowed to do what they would do regardless, but in ways that served the structure rather than threatened it. Nothing about it happened by accident. The first winter in the completed structure taught him two things he had not expected. The first was that the sod roof performed beyond what he had calculated. The snow that accumulated on it did not press down through the clay layer the way some part of him had wondered if it might. Instead, it acted as additional insulation, a second layer above the first, slowing the escape of interior heat, stabilizing the temperature inside the structure in a way that a bare roof could never manage. The interior temperature on the coldest nights was warmer than he had recorded in any previous winter shelter he had used, by a margin that surprised him enough to note it twice. The second thing was a flaw he had not anticipated. The east wall, where the entrance passage turned, was collecting condensation from the temperature differential between the cold exterior stone and the warm interior air. The moisture was not dramatic, a surface dampness, nothing more, but he understood what sustained moisture did to a stone structure over years, and he spent 3 evenings working through the problem in his notebook before he arrived at the answer. The entrance passage needed a short air gap, a deliberate dead zone where outside air could transition before entering the main space. He added a second interior door 6 feet inside the first, creating a small vestibule, and lined the passage walls with a secondary course of dry-stacked stone, with a gap behind it that allowed air to circulate without allowing moisture to accumulate against the primary wall. He tested the revision through the following winter. The condensation stopped. Months of careful planning had still left a flaw. The flaw, once found, had a solution. The solution had been tested and confirmed. That was the process, and he did not find it discouraging. He found it clarifying, the way any honest accounting is clarifying when you are willing to look at what it says. He also spent the autumn of 1884 and the autumn of 1885 reading the mountain in ways that had nothing to do with the structure itself. He watched the snowpack on the northern faces above the valley. He watched the way the water came off the high ridges in spring. He noted the cycles of early frost and late frost over 4 years in his pocketbook and looked at what the numbers told him about the direction things were moving. They told him a hard winter was accumulating its evidence. He did not know when. He was not a man who claimed to predict what he could only observe and estimate. But by the autumn of 1885, he had added a second year's worth of preserved food to the rear alcove. He had reinforced the timber members of the roof frame with 2 additional posts set into stone footings. He had cut and stacked more wood than he believed he would need and stacked it under the sandstone overhang where the snow could not reach it. The mountains were preparing to deliver their verdict. He did not say this to anyone in the valley. What he said, when asked why he was adding to his woodpile in September, was that a man his age slept better with more than he needed than with less than he required. The valley men laughed at that too. The storm arrived on the 15th of January. Elias had seen it coming for 2 days in the way that a man sees something coming when he has learned to read the signs that announce it, the particular color of the northern sky, the behavior of the animals, the drop in temperature that preceded the cloud mass by 36 hours, the silence that fell over the high timber the evening before. He had brought everything inside that needed to be inside. He had checked every joint of the roof frame by hand, pressing against each timber the way you press a fence post to test whether it has given anything to the ground. He had not found weakness. He went to sleep on the night of the 14th with the dog at his feet and the fire banked to a reliable 8-hour burn, and he slept as well as he had slept in years. The valley below did not sleep as well. The storm built through the night, and by morning it was a thing that had taken the landscape and rewritten it. The temperature dropped to levels that the old-timers would spend years arguing about because the numbers seemed improbable. The wind came off the northern face in sustained walls rather than gusts, and the snow was not light. It was the heavy, wet, compacting snow that is the most dangerous kind because it accumulates without looking like it is accumulating, and then presents its total weight all at once to whatever is beneath it. In the valley, the problem became apparent by the second evening. The boarding house at the south end of the settlement was the first large structure to show distress. The owner, a man named Silas Webb, had built it 4 years before with ambition and green timber, and had patched and expanded it twice since, adding roofline to roofline in the way that profitable frontier structures grow, quickly, cheaply, without the patience that careful construction requires. The sounds it began making on the second night were not the sounds of a structure in discomfort. They were the sounds of a structure in the process of making a decision. The guests had been moved to the lower rooms by the time the east wing let go. No one was killed in that collapse. This was a piece of luck that nobody fully acknowledged until later, because in the moment there was too much else happening. 3 other cabins in the lower settlement had already lost their roofs. The Halverson family, whose structure Elias had looked at with concern he had not expressed, were sheltering in what remained of their east wall with a fire they were feeding from furniture, and they would not be reached until the morning of the 3rd day. On Madman's ledge, the snow continued to accumulate on the sod roof. By the storm's peak, the depth above the roof had reached 4 feet, then 5. Then, in the drifted sections near the north wall where the hillside channeled the wind, something close to 7. The roof did not move. The interior temperature, measured by a small thermometer Elias kept on the south wall, dropped 4 degrees over the 3 days of the storm's worst passage. 4 degrees. From the warmth of a normal winter evening to the warmth of a slightly cooler winter evening. He sat in his chair by the window on the second night and listened to the wind pressing against the valley below, and watched the darkness where the settlement was, and kept his lantern burning in the window, because he understood that a light in a window during a storm is a form of language, and he wanted the language to be legible to anyone still in a position to read it. The dog sat beside him and did not appear concerned. The storm had finished testing the house. The house had held. He went down on the morning of the 4th day, when the storm had reduced itself to a general gray discomfort without the violence of the previous nights. He went down with the dog and a length of rope and a short-handled spade, and a pack with enough food for 8 people for 2 days, which he had prepared on the second evening because he knew what the morning would require, and he saw no reason to arrive unprepared. The snow in the valley was chest-deep in the even places and over his head in the drifts. He moved along the line of the hillside where the natural features had kept the accumulation manageable, the same way he had moved through difficult mountain terrain for 40 years, not quickly, but without wasted effort, following the logic of the landscape rather than the most direct line. He reached the Halverson place first. He found all 5 of them alive, which was not the outcome he had fully allowed himself to assume. The father had managed through the night by making the right decisions in the right order, which is what survival in that country most often reduces to in the end. Elias helped them out through a gap in the south wall and moved them up the hillside by degrees to his own structure, where they stayed for the following 3 days while the valley organized itself. Over those 3 days, 8 people sheltered in a structure built for one. It was not comfortable. It was warm. It was dry. It was structurally sound under a snow load that had destroyed a third of the permanent structures in the settlement, and it was available, and those 4 qualities together were more than sufficient. Elias Webb, whose boarding house had lost its east wing, and was now holding together on the architectural optimism of the remaining 2 walls, came up the hillside on the second morning with his hat in his hand, and a specific expression that Elias recognized, because he had worn it himself on several occasions in his life. It is the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he would have preferred to arrive at sooner, and is uncertain whether to lead with the conclusion or with the apology. Elias did not make it more difficult than it needed to be. He handed Silas a cup of coffee and showed him the pocket notebook, and spent the better part of an afternoon explaining the principles involved: the mass of the earth behind the north wall, the insulating behavior of sod under snow load, the air gap in the entrance passage, the angle of the chimney vent, the positioning of the food stores, the way the south-facing window collected winter sun. And Silas listened with the quality of attention that a man gives something when he understands that his life might have depended on the gap between what he knew and what he is now being told. The mountain had delivered its judgment. It had delivered it without opinion, without malice, without the particular interest in being right that human arguments tend to carry. It had simply applied weight until the truth of each structure became apparent, and the truth of each structure had been written into it by the decisions made during its construction, and those decisions reached back to questions that most men in the valley had never thought to ask. Elias Croft rebuilt his food stores that spring and reinforced the roof frame in 2 places where he had noted, under the load, a deflection he wanted to address before the next season. He was not a man who confused surviving a test with having nothing left to learn. The test had confirmed what he believed and revealed 2 things he had not anticipated, and he considered both outcomes valuable. He helped Elias Webb rebuild the boarding house. He did not design it, he was clear about that, because he was a trapper and not an architect, and he held precise opinions about the dangers of expertise claimed beyond its actual boundaries. But he walked the site with Silas before the new framing went up, and he asked questions. And the questions were the kind that caused Silas to make different decisions than he would otherwise have made. And the structure that went up that summer was a different building than the one the storm had helped dismantle. It stood through the following 3 winters without difficulty. Several of the men in the valley spent time on Madman's ledge in the years after 1886, looking at the structure and asking questions that they would not have asked before. Elias answered all of them. He was not a withholding man. He understood that knowledge kept to oneself dies when the person keeping it dies, and he had already made peace with the fact that most of what he had learned about mountains and cold, and the behavior of building materials under stress had been given to him by other people who had paid for it with their own difficulty. He kept the pocket notebook until the end of his life. It was not a remarkable object, a standard field book, the kind sold at any general store in the territory, water-stained and rebound twice, and filled with observations that would have appeared unremarkable to anyone who did not know how to read them. But for those who spent time with it, the notebook told a particular story that the storm of 1886 had told first, and that the notebook had only recorded. Stone waits men learn. The men who learn are the ones who choose, in the years before the test arrives, to pay attention to the right things. Not the fastest things, not the cheapest things, not the things that receive the agreement of the men around them, but the right things. The things that the mountain will later confirm. Elias Croft lived on Madman's ledge until 1903. He never built a second structure. He never needed to. The sod roof grew a new layer of grass each spring and shed its snow each winter and was still holding, by all accounts, the year he finally came down from the hillside for the last time, not because the structure had failed him, but simply because a man of 73 has earned the right to sleep somewhere flatter. He left the notebook on the stone bench inside the south wall. Whoever found it first found it there.